Hey friends, what do you want me to tell you? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Chaf Aleph, Daf 21 of Masechta Megilla. Friends, we begin the third parak of Masechta Megilla. How are you guys liking Masechta Megilla so far? Very nice, right? Yeah. Anyways, we start the third parak of Masechta Megillah. We talk a little bit about reading the Megillah, about reading from the Torah. Also, different aliyahs and things like that. So it's very interesting things. Let's get started. We're kind of, because you guys behaved yesterday, so we finished the second parak of Megillah. So now we're starting the third parak. We're about halfway through the Amud on Chaf Aleph Mud Aleph. So that's what happens when you behave. Let's go weiter. It says the Mishnah, beginning of the third parak, HaKorias Megillah Omid V'Yoshev. Okay, so you can read the Megillah standing or sitting. Do I ever read the Megillah sitting? I don't think so. I think I'm usually standing. V'Kra Echad Kra'ua Shnaim Yotzu. If one fellow reads the Megillah, or if two, they do a duet, Yotzu. It works. Okay. So a place where the minhag is to make a blessing. The Gemara is going to explain what it means exactly. But the place where the minhag is to make a blessing, so you make a blessing. And if the minhag is not to make a blessing, so as Rashi says, you don't have to make a blessing. Okay. So on Mondays, Thursdays, and on Shabbos at Mincha, when we read from the Torah, Korin Shlosha, so we get 3 aliyahs. No less, no more. Okay? On Monday and Thursday and on Shabbos and Mincha, 3 aliyahs, no less, no more. Ve'en maftir benavi, and there's no haftorah, there's no maftir on Monday, Thursday, and Shabbos Mincha. And the fellow who begins reading the Torah and the fellow who ends reading the Torah makes a blessing beforehand, and afterwards. The assumption, I believe, in the Mishnah right now is that Keilu, only the first person would make a blessing and the last person would make a blessing, but in the middle they would not. The Gemara is going to get into some details there. Of course, we make a blessing before, at the beginning of the Aliyah and at the end of the Aliyah, not just at the beginning of the entire Torah reading and at the end of the entire Torah reading. Okay. Bracha Chodashim on Rosh Chodesh, U'v'chulo Shamoed and Achol HaMoed, Korin Arba. So on Rosh Chodesh and Achol HaMoed, we have 4 aliyahs. Okay. In Pochstim and Ben Mosif and Alein, no less, no more. Ben Maftim Benovi, and we don't read Haftorah, right? Of course, in Rosh Chodesh, we don't read Haftorah. Okay. HaPosach V'chosim B'Torah, and whoever starts and finishes reading the Torah, so they make a blessing before reading the Torah and after reading the Torah. This is the general rule. Musaf ve'eno yomtiv. So if there's Musaf that day, but it isn't a day of yomtiv, right? It's not like a day of Chag. So then Korin Arba, you read 4 aliyahs. So for example, Rosh Chodesh, Chol HaMoed, b'yomtiv, if it's actual yomtiv, right? So for example, I don't know, the first day of Pesach, Chamisha. So there's 5 aliyahs. Yom HaKippurim Shisha. On Yom Kippur, so 6 aliyahs on Yom Kippur. B'Shabbos Shiva. And on Shabbos, of course, we read 7 aliyahs. In Pochas in Men, we don't read any less than that. So for example, on Yom Tov, you're not going to have any less than 5 aliyahs. However, Aval Mosifin Alein, you're allowed to add on to them. Anybody ever been at a synagogue where there was like more than 7 aliyahs? Sometimes they'll do it if there's like a simcha in town and you have to give everybody an aliyah, because otherwise there's going to be brigis. And there's no motivator to do anything like brigis. It's a really, it's a very powerful thing, brigis. Okay. So Aval Mosifin Alein, and but so we can add on to them in order to not exactly avert brigis, but in order brigis inspired. Umaftirim Benovi, and we also read from the Navi, the Haftorah, on Yom Tiv and on Yom Kippur and on Shabbos. And of course, there is a blessing before and after the Torah reading. Alright, that was a nice Mishnah, right? It says the Gemara Tana, Masha'enkein Batorah. So we say that so the first thing that the Mishnah said was that you're allowed, that you can read the Megillah either standing or sitting. So now, that's interesting. I feel like you don't see people sitting so much. Maybe we should bring it back. Babylon time, we should bring it back. But I'm a stander, man. I'm totally a stander. Yeah, I'm a big standing chassid. Alright. So Masha'enkein Batorah, which is not the case by Torah, that you have to stand. So Minani Mile, how do we know this? So Amar Babo, to Amar Kra, says Babo that the pasuk says Va'ata po amod imadi, that the Eibishter says to Moshe, why don't you come and stand with me? That will stand. And so we see from there that when you are right, what does the pasuk say? The pasuk says, Ve'ata po amod imadi, come and stand with me. Va'adabra elecha, and I will speak to you. Eis kol hamitzvah v'chukim v'mishpatim asher tlamdeim, basically all of the Torah, right? So basically, Moshe Rabbeinu and God were standing when they were studying Torah together. Ve'amar Babo, says Babo, ilmalei mikra kasuv yefshel omro. If not for the fact that we have a pasuk that says that God is standing with Moshe, we would not be able to say it on our own. It's as though even God is standing as well. And says how do you know that you shouldn't have the teacher like on some kind of fancy bed or couch and have the students sitting on the ground? Shneimar, as the pasuk says, as it says, God says to Moshe, why don't you come and stand with me? So it wasn't like, God was on a pedestal, and therefore, if you have a student, a teacher as well, you shouldn't be on like a fancy seat and have everybody else sitting on the floor. Rather, they should either all be on fancy seats or all be on the floor. Taner Rabbanon, the rabbis taught me most Moshe, okay, from the time of Moshe Rabbeinu v'ad Rabban Gamliel. So there's a note here that says Hazakin. So let's read it with Hazakin. So from the days of Moshe until the days of Rabban Gamliel Hazakin. Who is Rabban Gamliel Hazakin? The grandfather of Rabban Gamliel and the great-great-grandfather of Rebbe. Okay, and the grandson of Hillel. Okay. So from the days of Moshe until Rabban Gamliel Hazakin, Lohayu lemeidin Torah elam umad. When they would study Torah, it would always be standing. However, Mishemeis Rabban Gamliel Hazakin, once Rabban Gamliel Hazakin passed away, Yored Choli la'olam, then sickness befell the world. Vayu lemeidin Torah miyushav, and that is when they would and from at that point they began studying Torah while they were sitting. And this is the Mishnah. This is what is meant by the Mishnah in Sota that says that once Rabban Gamliel Hazakin passed away, Batul Kvod Torah, the honor of the Torah was nullified. Until the days of Rabban Gamliel Hazakin, they would always study Torah standing. But once Rabban Gamliel Hazakin passed away, then we started studying sitting, and then Batul Kvod Torah, the honor of the Torah, was nullified. Kasuv Echad Omer, we have one pasuk that says Va'eshev Bahar. We have one pasuk that in which Moshe says that he sat on the mountain. V'chasuv Echad Omer Va'anochi Amadti Bahar. And the other pasuk says that Moshe Rabbeinu stood on the mountain. Omer Rav, says Rav, Omed V'lomed Yoshev V'shoneh. Interesting. So when he would study it the first time, he would be standing. When he would repeat it and go over it and review it, he would be sitting. Interesting. Reb Chanina Amar, says Reb Chanina, Lo Omed V'lo Yoshev Ela Shocha. Says Reb Chanina, actually he was neither sitting nor standing. He was taka something in the middle. He was slouched over, bent over. All right. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, says Rabbi Yochanan in Yeshiva Ela Lashon Hakava. Oh, so Rabbi Yochanan says that when the pasuk says Va'eshev Bahar, that I sat on the mountain, it doesn't literally mean that he sat down on the mountain. It means he stayed on the mountain. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, Vateshu b'Kadesh Yom Rabim, that they stayed in Kadesh for a long time. It doesn't mean that they sat in Kadesh for a long time. I don't know what they were doing. Maybe they were standing. What do you want me to tell you? But they stayed there. Rava Amar, says Rava, Rakos Mu'umad v'Kashos Miyushav, says Rava, the more difficult segments of the Torah, the more challenging parts of the Torah, Moshe Rabbeinu sat for. The easier parts, he stood for. Alright, very nice. Moving on. The Mishnah had said that if one fellow read from the Torah, or if if they did a duet, they're Yotzei Tana, Masha'en came by Torah. We learned in a Brisa that is not okay to do so when it comes to the Torah. By the Torah, you can't have a duet. No duets. What do you want me to tell you? When it comes to the Torah, so you have one reader, one translator. But you can't have one reader and two translators. No, right? Because of course, back then they would read a verse and then they would have somebody translate it. We don't do that anymore. We just try to go through as quickly as we can. Well, I'm joking. And when it comes to reading from the prophets, you can have one fellow reading it and two people translating it simultaneously. Alright. Just don't have two people reading it also, right? Two people reading and two people translating. When it comes to the recitation of the Hallel and to reading the Megillah, you can even have 10 readers and 10 translators. My time outcome, this is what we learned this in Masechta Rosh Hashanah, because since these things, Hallel, Megillah, are things that are very beloved upon the people, they're going to pay attention. Right? Even if you have, what's 10 people singing together? That's already a choir. Even if you have a choir saying the Hallel, or a choir reading from the Megillah, since this is something that you care about, so you're going to pay attention and hear what you need to hear. So a place where the minig is to make a bracha on the Megillah, so they make a bracha. This whole thing about if they have the minig, they make the bracha. If they don't have the minig, they don't make the bracha. So that's only the bracha after reading the Megillah. Avo lefanel, but the bracha before reading the Megillah, which we'll get to in a minute, mitzvah levarich. It is a mitzvah to make a blessing before reading the Megillah. Amar Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, that says of Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, Kol ha-mitzvahs kulan mivarech alen over la'asiyason, that all mitzvahs, you make a blessing before doing them. My mashma dai over lishna ta'akdumehu. How do we know that when it says over la'asiyason, it means before doing the mitzvahs? So Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak on Makra, says Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak that the pasuk says Vayaretz Achimaatz derech hakika vayavar sakushi, that it says Achimaatz took a certain route and he passed before the Kushi who was running in front of him. So we see that Vayavor means before, to come before. So Abaye Omar says Abaye Mehachav Mirvu Avar Lifnei, right? It says that Yaakov Avinu passed before all the people when he's going to Esav. Or if you want to say Mehachav Mir Vayavar Malkum Lifnei B'Hashem Baroshim, that their king passed before them and God was at the helm. So those are three examples of that over means before. So over la'asiyason means, right, that you make a bracha over la'asiyason means you make a bracha before doing a mitzvah. Very, very, very beautiful. It says the Gemara, Lefanea my mevarich uwa. So what blessing do you make before the Megillah? So if Sheshes mikatrazia ikla l'kamid Ravashi. So if Sheshes from Katrazia went before Ravashi, uvarich manach. He said, you know what bracha he made? Manach. Friends, what does manach mean? It's a Rosh Tevis. It's a abbreviation. Is that what it's called? I don't know. Mem is for Megillah, right? Al Mikra Megillah. The Nun is for Sha'asa Nisim Lavosinu B'Yom Mem Bazman Hazeh. And Ches is for Shechayanu. Alright. La'acharei my mevarich. What blessing do you make after reading from the Megillah? Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, harabes rivenu, who fights our fights, v'adonis dinenu, and he judges our judgments. V'anokim es nikmasenu, somebody who avenges our vengeances. V'anifra lanu mitzarenu, and somebody who exacts from nudniks, nudniks who are sort of focusing their nudnik focus against us, so God exacts a price from them. Thanks God. And somebody who pays back bad stuff to all of our enemies, the enemies of our souls. Wow. The enemy of my soul. Huh. And then we say, blessed is God who pays back for the Yidden from all the nudniks. Alright. Rava Amar Akel Moshiach. Rava says that you make the bracha Akel Moshiach, God who saves. Amar Papa says a Papa, classic of Papa. Hilkach Neimrinu L'Tarayu, therefore we'll make a compromise and say both. Baruch Ata Hashem Hanifra L'Yisrael Mikol Tzareim Akel Moshiach. Blessed are you, God, who pays back for the Yidden from all of their nudniks. God who saves. Alright. Sounds like a lot of fun, right? Everybody getting excited for reading the Megillah? Where do you usually go for reading the Megillah? I read a Megillah last year in somebody's garage. I think it was pre-COVID vaccines, at least where I was. Yeah, but it was alright. It was outside, right? It was during like the whole outside thing. I was in Chutz La'aretz, of course. I was in Chutz La'aretz. Yeah, I read in some guy's garage or something. At least I was in the garage. Some people were outside. But I was in the garage, I think. Alright. Let's go weiter. So, so, on Monday and on Thursday and on Shabbos at Mincha, so we read 3 aliyahs. So, ani shlosha k'neged mi? That's a good question. These 3 aliyahs that we have on Monday, Thursday, Shabbos, Mincha, what do they represent? Rav Asi k'neged Torah Nevi'im Uchsuvim. Alright, says Rav Asi, they represent Torah, the prophets, and the writings. Alright, Rav Amar k'neged Kohanim Leviim v'Yisraelim. Rav says they represent the Kohanim, the Leviim, and Yisraelim. Alright, that sounds good. Ela hadutani Rav Shimi, that which Rav Shimi taught in Pochas in Miyud Psukin b'Beis HaKnesses Vaydaber Olam min HaMinyan. So when Rav Shimi says that when we read the Torah in Shul, so you always read at least 10 psukim, and if one of the 10 is Vaydaber Hashem Moshe Lemor, which is like kind of a pretty standard pasuk, that's okay, it counts as one of the 10. Who can give me who can give me an example of when we read 9 psukim? As far as I know, it's the only time. But it's Taka on Purim. Vayavo Amalek is 9 psukim. So I think Purim Davka is the only time that we read 9 psukim. Hani Asar K'neged B, so that these 10 psukim which we generally read, at least 10, so what do they represent? Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi K'neged Asar Batlonin Shebebeis HaKnesses. Okay, it's like the 10 people who are always found in the synagogue. Rav Yosef Amar said, Rav Yosef K'neged Aseres Adibros Shenemru L'Moshe B'Sinai. Says Rav Yosef, they represent the 10 commandments that God gave Moses, or were said to Moses at Mount Sinai. Rabbi Yochanan Omar, and says Rabbi Yochanan K'neged Asar Ma'amar Shebenivra Olam. K'neged the 10 utterances that were uttered in creating the world. Hey Ninu, what are these 10 utterances? Vayomer de Bereshis. So it's the if you count up, every time it says Vayomer in the creation of the world. Hani Tisha B'Av. But 1 second, isn't that only 9? So Bereshis Nami Maimeru. Bereshis also counts as one of them. The pasuk says, "B'dvar Hashem Shamayim Naisu v'Achpiv Kol Tzvam," that in the words of God, the heavens were created, and with the wind of His mouth, the breath of His mouth, all of their stuff in the sky. So we see that the creation of the world was B'dvar Hashem, was with the word of God. So the fact that it says Bereshis bara Elokim es Hashmayim v'Haaretz, it says Vayomer, He said, because it counts as an utterance, since it was in an utterance of God that it was all created. So that's 10. Amar Rava says, Rava Rishon Shekara Arba'a Mishubach. So if we have 10 psukim, so one of the aliyos, right, if we're only going to be reading 10 psukim, so one of the aliyos is going to get 4 psukim, the other 2 are going to get 3. So it says Rava, if it's the first fellow who gets an aliyah, if it's the Rishon, reads 4 psukim, so then Meshubach. Sheni Shekar Arba Meshubach. And guess what? If the first fellow reads 3 and the second fellow reads 4, Givaldik. Shlishi Shekar Arba, what do you think? If the first 2 read 3 each and the third guy read 4, Meshubach. Also Givaldig. Rishon Shakar Arba Meshubach. How do we know that it's great if the first person reads 4 psukim? It's not, as the pasuk says, b'shalosh kupis shel shalosh sa'in shebein torminis alishka. So we learned in Masechta Shkalim how they would have that they would sort of separate these coins at 3 times and put them into these boxes. So v'haya kasav alein, it said on them Aleph Beis Gimel. Okay, so on each of the boxes it was marked. One had an Aleph, one had a Beis, one had a Gimel. Later Ezemein Nisum Rishon, to know which one was donated first. La'akiv mimena Rishon shemitzvah barishon, so that the box that was donated from the first donation, so the funds would start coming from that box because it's a mitzvah. We give precedence to the one that came first. So therefore, here also by the aliyos, if it's the first of the 3 aliyos that reads 4 psukim, great. But we also said that if the first fellow reads 3 and the second fellow reads 4, that's also good. The Tanya is within the Brisa Amul Pnei Menorah Ya'iru, that by the menorah, so there were 7 flames in the menorah, and they all sort of faced the middle one. So Milamed Shemitzade Pneim Klapi Ner Maravi, so that all other 6 flames, 3 on each side of the middle one, would face the middle one. V'ner Maravi Klapi Shechina, and the middle one was sort of extended towards the west, towards the Heichel. So we see that there's something special about the middle one, that all of the other 6 flames were facing the middle one. So we see from here that the middle one is very special. But we also said that if the fellow gets the 3rd aliyah, he reads 4 psukim, so 3, 3, and 4. That's also great. Because we go up in holiness, we don't go down, and therefore, if the first fellow reads 4 and the next 2 read 3, so that we went down. Or if the first one reads 3, the second one reads 4, but then the third one reads 3 again, we went down. But if you have 3, 3, and then you go up to 4, so that's geshmak. So Rav Papa visited the synagogue of Abi Guber. The Kara Rishon Arba V'Shibchei Rav Papa. And the first fellow to get an aliyah at the Torah, he read 4 verses, and Rav Papa gave him a pat on the back. He says, "Good job." In Pochsen Mein V'Mosifin, so we don't have less than 3 or more than 3. Tana Posech Mivarch Lefneim Lefanea V'Chos Mivarch Lachreah. So we learn in a brisa that, so let's say we have 3 aliyahs. So the guy who gets the first aliyah, he'll make a bracha before reading from the Torah, and then there's no more brachas until the end. And then the last fellow to get an aliyah makes the bracha afterwards. So it's basically just 1 bracha before all the reading and 1 blessing after all the reading. And nowadays, that of course anybody who's been to synagogue for a Torah reading knows that there is a blessing before and after each individual aliyah. The reason for that is we're concerned about the people who leave early and come late, right? The people who leave early, right? If there was only a blessing before all the reading, and then somebody left in the middle, so you might think that there's no blessing after the reading. Or vice versa. If somebody came in the middle and all he heard was the blessing afterwards, he wouldn't know that there was also a blessing beforehand. So therefore we say that every aliyah gets a blessing beforehand and afterwards, so that everybody knows that there's a blessing before and after each aliyah. Alright? Fine. Well, before and after reading from the Torah. Fine. So we said that on Rosh Chodesh, on Chol HaMoed, we read 4 psukim, okay? Ba'a mine Ula bar Rav mirava. So Ula bar Rav asked a kasha from Rava. What do you think he asked him? Parshas Rosh Chodesh Ketzad Korinosa. That on Rosh Chodesh, how do you divide up the Torah reading? Tzavas b'nei Yisrael v'amata aleim skor b'nei lachmi. So it starts off with Tzavas b'nei Yisrael v'amata aleim skor b'nei lachmi. Fine. Dahavin tmanya psuke. That they are 8 psukim. So how do we do it? Heichi naivet. How do we divide it up? Nikrei trade tlasa. So if the first 2 aliyahs were 3 psukim each, tlasa psukim pashulu trei. So the thing is, so we're saying that etc. So that's a total of 8 verses. So how are you going to divide that up into the different aliyahs? If we try to divide up the 8 verses into 3 aliyahs, well, it means that the first 2 people read 3 psukim each. So that's 6. Now that means that there are only 2 left for the next aliyah, but we don't stop. We don't stop reading of the Torah when there's less than 3 verses left in the section. And if you read 6 out of the 8, then there's only 2 left in the section. So Nikre arba, and if we say, okay, fine, no problem. So why don't we just, the first 2 aliyahs, we'll read 4 psukim each. Okay, that would be it's karbani lachmi. But then it continues. So, right, there's uviyom Shabbos, right? So pashlu shiva. So there's another 7 psukim left over. Uviyom Shabbos havyon trei v'shechot shechem havyon chamisha. Right? That the first part that we read on Rosh Chodesh is karbani lachmi liishai. But that's the first section. Then after that, there's a section of Uviyom Shabbos, and then following that, there's a section of Uvrosh Chodshechem. Now, Uviyom Shabbos is 2 verses, Uvrosh Chodshechem is 5 verses. So if we say that as Karbani Lachmi Leishai, which is 8 verses, so the first aliyah reads 4 of them, the second aliyah reads the next 4 of them. Now we're up to the third aliyah. Now we're up to Uviyom Shabbos. Now Uviyom Shabbos is only 2 psukim. So what do? We said that each aliyah needs to be a minimum of 3. So by Pashlu Shiva of Yom HaShabbos havin trei, Uvrosh Chodshechem havin chamisha, Heichi Naivid, how do you divide up the 2 and 5? Nikre trei me ha v'chad mehana. If we say, well, why don't we read 2, right, so the third aliyah will be the 2 psukim from Uviyom HaShabbos plus 1 pasuk from Uvrosh Chodshechem, in Maschilim b'parsha pachus mishlosha psukim. But when we start a parsha, we don't read less than 3 psukim. Right, so we're not just going to read 1 verse from Uvrosh Chodshechem. Likre trei, meha v'tlosa mehach. And if you're going to say, okay, fine, so read both psukim from Uviyom Shabbos, and then read the first 3 psukim of Uvrosh Chodshechem. Well, that's a problem because there's only 5 psukim in Uvrosh Chodshechem, so pashlu trei, which means that, right, if you read the first 3 verses of Rosh Chodshechem, there's only 2 left, and we just said that you don't stop reading when there's less than 3 verses left. So Amr lo zo lo shamaiti. So Rava responds to Ula Barab, and he says, look, I didn't hear an exact answer to that query. However, Kayotze bo shamaiti, I heard something similar, which is the Tananas we learn in the Mishnah, Bayom Arishon Bereishis Vihi Rakia. Friends, of course, we learned this in Masechta Tainus, that on the first day, right, the Maimados, that these people who would be praying for the Korbanis in their synagogues around the country, so they would fast, and on the first day, on Sunday, they would read Bereishis and Vihi Rakia. Now, V'tani Alam, we taught about it, Bereishis B'shnayim, that the parsha, that the Bereishis verses are 2 aliyahs, Yehi Rakia be'echad, and the Yehi Rakia verses is 1 aliyah. I don't know what I just said, but the Bereishis part is 2 aliyahs, and the Yehi Rakia part is 1 aliyah. But we ask, B'shlom Yehi Rakia be'echad, I understand that Yehi Rakia is 1 aliyah because it's 3 psukim. Okay, great. Bereishis B'shnayim Chamisha psukei avu. But we said, wait, but how could Bereishis be divided into 2 aliyahs? It's 5 psukim. V'tanya akor b'Torah lo yifchos mishlosha psukim. And somebody who reads from the Torah shouldn't have any less than 3. So if it's a total of 5 psukim, how can we divide that amongst 2 people? So V'it Marla, and it was taught about it, Rav Madole Gishmul and Posek. Rav says, no problem, you repeat a pasuk twice, and Shmuel says, no, you cut a pasuk in half. So we see that there are solutions for when there aren't enough verses to go around, and therefore what Rav is saying is that also by Rosh Chodesh, you're right, that if the first section is 8 psukim, we divide that into 2, so we have 4 psukim and 4 psukim, then there's the remaining 7, and we're having trouble figuring out how to divide it up, because, you can't just read 2 psukim, then you have to go into the next parsha, but then you have to go at least 3, but then there's only 2 left, but you can, it's a machlokas. Rav says you would just repeat a pasuk, Shmuel says you would cut 1 in half, but there are kind of ways of making it work. Friends, that was the Chaf Aleph of Masechta Megillah. Friends, we started the third parak today. We learned about some halachis about reading the Megillah, that you can read it standing, you can read it sitting. We also learned, right, what we said, you could do a duet if that's your thing. We also learned about the different times that we read Torah, right? On Monday, Thursday, Shabbos, Mincha, there are 3 aliyahs. On Rosh Chodesh and on Chol Hamoed there's 4 aliyahs. On Yom Tov there's 5. On Yom Kippur there's 6. On Shabbos there are 7. We learned about the brachos in the Megillah, right? Who can tell me what the brachos in the Megillah are? Al Mikra Megillah, Shas Anisim, and Shechianu. We also learned about the bracha that we make after the Megillah. We learned what the 3 aliyahs are, what they represent. One option was that they represent Kohanim, Levim, and Yisraelim. The other option was that it represents Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim. Well, this is great stuff. Then we said, what about the 10 verses that you have to read? So we had different versions over there. Rabbi Shua ben Levi had said that it's connected to 10 people who are always to be found in the synagogue. Rav Yosef said that it is connected the 10 commandments that were received at Mount Sinai. And Rabbi Yochanan says it's connected to 10 utterances that were uttered in the creation of the world. We then talked about how exactly do we, we said that, right, exactly, how do we divide up the different verses? So let's say you have 10 total verses, 3 aliyahs. So we ultimately said, look, one of them is going to get 4 psukim, whichever one gets those 4 psukim, that is fine, whether it's the first aliyah, the second aliyah, the third aliyah. And then we got in at the end about how exactly do we divide up the aliyahs for Rosh Chodesh, because it's a little bit trickier. There isn't really an easy way to divide it up. So ultimately, we got into the machlokas between Rav and Shmuel about what you do when there aren't enough psukim to go around. Rav says that you just repeat a pasuk. Shmuel says you cut one in half. Friends, I hope you enjoyed Daf Chaf Aleph. Peace.